Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it is talking about one of my favorite positions in all of fantasy sports. Maybe not your favorite positions when it comes to drafting in fantasy football, but the defense and special teams units certainly are mine, just because of the way we've seen them rise and evolve these past couple of seasons. Truly becoming just one of the positions that really helps you really swing games in your favor these past couple of years. And all four of these defenses potentially going to be defensive units you might want to monitor for the next 5 years or so. Some of these defenses are familiar, some of these potentially not, but ultimately a top four that really will, in a couple of years, stand the test of time, in my opinion, because a lot of these defenses have room to improve and evolve even further should their defensive coordinators stick with them, because ultimately most of these defensive coordinators deserve to have jobs as head coaches in the NFL or even in college football. But ultimately, this top four I'm really excited to talk about. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the number 4 defense. Kind of a down year for them. As we'll see, the Pittsburgh Steelers, only 8.6 fantasy points per game average, under 37. I decided to stream them this season, and they really, over these past couple of weeks, kind of steadily decline. We see a lot more lapses and miscommunications within this defense than we have seen in recent memory for a lot of these Pittsburgh Steelers defenses we've talked about. And I ran this stat when we talk about all the playoff teams ESPN just released an article about that says that they gave them an average of 380.5 yards and 27.3 points in that 4-game span where they played a lot of those games during the holiday season against the top NFL teams with the Eagles, Ravens, Chiefs back-to-back. And yes, those are a tough group of teams to beat in any given circumstance. But you are the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. This is one of the top defenses in the entire National Football League we're talking about. Yes, they still lead the league in takeaways, and I love the look of the secondary when they're healthy, right? Because Dante Jackson was a big missing part of this defense, and ultimately we saw them decline a little bit because of that absence. But still, this is a defense that I feel like has slowly been on the downfall these past couple of weeks, and ultimately over the next couple of years we could see them fall out of the top 10 entirely should this continue. And I feel like this season is a microcosm of the best and worst of what you can get from the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. You can get the improvement of this very talented secondary, but then you start to see some lapses once key pieces go missing from it. So look for this Pittsburgh Steelers defense to surprisingly drop down the rankings from a fantasy and real-life perspective for the next couple of years, especially if they decide to transition after the season to a new head coaching regime, because I don't necessarily feel like Mike Tomlin's sustained success can be repeated with a new head coach. So look for this team to steadily decline a little bit, especially on the defensive side of the football, but they still sit at number 4 for what they brought to the table in terms of takeaways. Speaking of takeaways, let's talk about the Green Bay Packers, our number 3 defense for the 2024 fantasy football season. And this is a team that also was very astonishing when it came to taking the football away. Very talented secondary led by Xavier McKinney and Jair Alexander. Even though he missed through injury, he's going to be a big miss for them come the postseason. But ultimately, this is a team that I really feel really stuck with their identity throughout the entire regular season in terms of their defense. They took the football away and forced teams to really have to think about how they retain possession against them. They really, really, really impressed me in terms of how they helped this offense and how they really helped win the time possession battle, most importantly. Seahawks, I was really impressed by the time possession that was afforded them by how their defense played, both in their front and in their secondary as well. And so that's why I feel like this Packers defense, while I continuously kind of decide to shun them away and have them fall by the wayside for the year, still was very impressive in terms of how they continue to surprise people by taking the football away. And I feel like, it could be a harbinger of things to come for this Packers team, because I feel like even though they are getting older in their secondary a little bit, their front is getting younger. And if the front improves and the secondary declines, then that could give chances to a younger secondary. And the secondary depth in the next couple of drafts is looking pretty enticing. So I still believe that even if some kind of imbalance between these two defensive groups for the Packers start to show up, I do feel like they will have the capital to compensate for it, potentially make it up through the next couple of off seasons, should that be the case. But ultimately, I'm really excited and stoked to see the future of this Packers defense, especially in this postseason, seeing as to how, they didn't play well against the NFC's elite. They were 0-5 against the Eagles, Vikings, and Lions this season. So I really want to see how this defense translates in the very tough gauntlet that is the NFC postseason. Because if they show me enough against teams like the Eagles, who they'll be playing in the wild round, and if they win, then the Lions and Vikings and teams of that nature, then that will prove to me that this defense can really translate their success from this season to the next season as well, and for many seasons thereafter. But for now, I feel like this defense, it has to stay predicated with their identity of taking the football away. And that's what got them here in the first place. So kudos to this Green Bay Packers defense for really sticking with their identity, sticking with their MO, and forcing opposing offenses' hands all year long. But speaking of NFC North defenses, they were not as good as one of my dad's favorite teams in the league's defense. Kudos to them. The Minnesota Fighting Vikings, 9.8 fantasy points per game average, 157 total fantasy points there. Truly one of my favorite defenses to watch in all of the NFL, especially because of one of the defensive masterminds of the season, Brian Flores. Give this man another chance at a head coaching job, and I guarantee you he'll become one of the most fearsome head coaches in the next decade or so because of what he's done with this Minnesota Vikings defense. I feel like this defense coming into the season really didn't have its share of superstars. It was just a bunch of guys, whether it be through the draft or quote-unquote aging out of this team or free agent acquisitions, who really were going to try and come together as some kind of conglomeration that could really help this team transition. This wasn't meant to be a breakout year for the Minnesota Vikings defense, and yet it truly was because of Brian Flores' plans for it. The way he disguised coverages, the way he brought back the years with guys like Harrison Smith, Stephon Gilmore, made Cam Bynum and Josh Metellus vital pieces of his defense, really nicely incorporated these free agent acquisitions and Jonathan Greenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman into his system as well. He got the most out of this defense, more so than any other defensive coordinator could have possibly done. And as a result, I'm really, really, really thrilled to say that this Vikings defense is primed for the next couple of years. No matter what happens with it, no matter if Brian Flores does end up getting a head coaching job somewhere else, no matter how many pieces might leave, because I'm sure that guys like Smith and Gilmore aren't necessarily looking to extend their stay that much longer. But ultimately, this Minnesota Vikings defense has proved that no matter who's out there, they can really, really be an elite NFL defense. And so that's why I'm really stoked for the future of this Minnesota Vikings team, not just because of what they did offensively, because of this defense. If this defense continuously shows that they can perform like this on a consistent basis, then the Minnesota Vikings have all the opportunities to win their first ever Super Bowl in this next decade, even potentially this year. But this defense really, really has surprised a lot of people, but not as much as the number one overall fantasy defense this year. Yes, over the past couple of weeks, they too, much like Pittsburgh, have declined as well. But this Denver Broncos defense, the no-name Denver Bronco defense, much like the Minnesota Vikings, really has shocked a lot of people. Yes, they had the star corner in Pat Surtain II, one of the best cornerbacks in the league, one of the best in terms of man coverage. But it's guys like Zach Allen, Cody Barton, Riley Moss, Jaquan McMillan, who are the unsung heroes of the Denver Bronco defense. Kudos to Vance Joseph as well, another former NFL head coach, much maligned, who ended up being a stellar defensive coordinator this year. I think that's the theme of this top 4 defense this year. All these much maligned head coaches becoming these fantastic defensive coordinators. But this Denver Broncos defense, number 3 in terms of efficiency. Yes, they had their problems late in the year. Still first in expected points added on defense. First in sacks, third in scoring defense. Ultimately, more in the sum of their parts. So getting back Riley Moss for this postseason push, it's going to be difficult. But ultimately, I'm really, really thrilled for the future of this Denver Broncos defense just because of all these no-name pieces really coming into their own. And it's still a young, deep, experienced defense that I'm really excited to see if Vance Joseph continuously improves on it if he remains in Denver. But ultimately, I'm just so honored to be able to recap this fantasy football season. It's been bittersweet to talk about it in such a way, but ultimately it will come to a close. But see you guys tomorrow for another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Remember to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features as well. But other than that, I'm out until tomorrow. Thank you all for tuning in.